The world collapsed in 1929, and while millions lost everything, a small group not only survived, but emerged stronger. This wasn't luck. This wasn't privilege. This was the application of a principle so counterintuitive that even today, nearly a century later, most people still don't grasp it. When the stock market crashed and banks failed, when unemployment reached 30% and entire fortunes evaporated overnight, Jewish families were implementing a survival strategy that had been refined through millennia of persecution and displacement. What they understood about wealth during that crisis reveals something profound about human nature and economic reality that modern society desperately tries to ignore. The Great Depression exposed a fundamental truth about wealth that most people completely misunderstand. Everyone focuses on what was lost during those years, but the real lesson lies in understanding what couldn't be taken away. Jewish communities had experienced this pattern countless times throughout history. Expelled from Spain in 1492, driven from various European territories, facing constant uncertainty about property rights and physical safety, they had developed an approach to wealth that transcended physical assets. When 1929 hit, this wasn't their first economic apocalypse. It was just another Tuesday in a long history of surviving the unsurvivable. Here's what separated those who rebuilt quickly from those who never recovered. While most Americans had concentrated their entire net worth in tangible assets like land, buildings, and physical businesses, Jewish families had diversified into something far more portable and resilient. Knowledge, skills, relationships, professional credentials. These assets traveled in the mind and couldn't be confiscated by a bank or destroyed by market collapse. A doctor who lost his savings still had his medical knowledge. A lawyer who lost his office still understood the law. An accountant whose firm closed still possessed numerical literacy that had value anywhere. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, because this principle applies regardless of geography or economy. The families who thrived after the crash understood something crucial about the nature of value itself. They had invested heavily in education long before the crisis hit. Not education as a status symbol or credential collection, but education as portable wealth. While their neighbors were buying bigger houses and newer cars during the Roaring '20s, Jewish families were often living more modestly and directing resources toward professional training, apprenticeships, and skill development for their children. This created an asymmetric advantage when everything collapsed. Consider what happened in major cities after the crash. Businesses failed at unprecedented rates. Property values plummeted. Physical assets became liabilities as people couldn't afford maintenance or property taxes. But the demand for certain skills and services actually increased during the Depression. People still got sick and needed doctors. Legal disputes over bankruptcies and foreclosures created demand for attorneys. Businesses trying to survive needed accountants who could navigate complex financial situations. Those who possessed these skills had converted their wealth into a form that couldn't be liquidated by market forces. The deeper pattern here reveals something about wealth that contradicts everything mainstream culture teaches. Society conditions you to believe wealth is primarily about accumulation of things. Bigger house, nicer car, more possessions, expanded property holdings. This creates psychological security because you can see and touch your wealth. It feels real, but this tangibility is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Anything that can be seen can be taken. Anything that can be touched can be destroyed. Anything tied to a specific location becomes a trap when that location becomes untenable. Jewish culture had learned through brutal experience that the most secure form of wealth is invisible. Skills live in the mind. Relationships exist in networks of trust and reciprocity. Reputation travels with you. Knowledge accumulates and compounds without requiring physical storage. These forms of capital had proven themselves through centuries of displacement and persecution. When you might need to flee with only what you can carry, you learn to carry wealth in forms that don't require luggage. The 1929 crash validated this approach on a massive scale. Families who had prioritized education found their children could generate income even in the depths of the Depression. A son who had studied dentistry could set up practice anywhere with minimal capital investment. A daughter who had learned bookkeeping could find work when companies were desperately trying to navigate financial chaos. These weren't glamorous positions, but they provided stability when stability was the most valuable commodity in existence. Compare this to families who had built wealth purely through property and physical business ownership. A factory owner watched his wealth evaporate when demand collapsed and he couldn't sell products. A landlord with multiple properties found himself unable to collect rent from unemployed tenants while still owing property taxes. A retail business owner saw inventory become worthless as consumer spending disappeared. Their wealth was entirely dependent on economic conditions beyond their control. They had built empires on sand, and the tide came in. The strategic brilliance here goes even deeper than simple diversification. Jewish families weren't just spreading risk across different asset classes. They were fundamentally reconceptualizing what wealth meant. Instead of asking how much money they could accumulate, they asked what capabilities they could develop. Instead of focusing on what they owned, they focused on what they could do. Instead of building wealth that required defending, they built wealth that required cultivating. This shift in perspective created a completely different relationship with economic uncertainty. When your wealth is primarily in physical assets, a crisis threatens everything you've built. You become defensive, protective, fearful of loss. But when your wealth is primarily in capabilities, a crisis becomes an opportunity to apply those capabilities in new ways. The same chaos that destroys one form of wealth creates demand for another. Medical skills become more valuable when people are stressed and sick. Legal expertise becomes more valuable when financial disputes proliferate. Teaching abilities become more valuable when traditional institutions fail and people seek alternative education. The 1929 crisis also revealed something crucial about community and collective resilience. Jewish families didn't just invest in individual education and skills. They invested in community infrastructure that provided mutual support during hard times, lending circles that predated modern banking, professional networks that shared opportunities and resources, educational institutions that continued functioning even when members faced financial hardship. This created a safety net that wasn't dependent on government intervention or economic conditions. When banks failed and savings disappeared, these community structures provided alternative forms of capital. A young person could access mentorship and training without tuition. A family could access emergency funds through community lending systems based on reputation and trust rather than collateral. A professional could find clients through network referrals rather than expensive advertising. These systems had been developed over generations specifically to function when formal institutions failed. The lesson here contradicts the individualistic narrative that dominates modern wealth culture. You're told that wealth building is primarily an individual pursuit. You accumulate, you invest, you protect. But the families who thrived through the Depression understood that individual wealth is fragile without community infrastructure. The strongest safety net isn't your personal savings account. It's your network of relationships with people who have complementary skills and shared values. It's your reputation within a community that knows your character and capabilities. It's your position within systems of mutual obligation and support. This communal approach to wealth also provided psychological resilience during the crisis. When your wealth is purely individual, failure becomes personally devastating. You've lost everything, and you face rebuilding alone. But when your wealth is embedded in community, failure becomes a temporary setback. The community provides resources, opportunities, and support for rebuilding. Your reputation and relationships remain intact even when your bank account doesn't. You haven't lost your position within the network of mutual support. Fast forward to today, and this same pattern repeats constantly. Yet most people still haven't learned the lesson. Every economic crisis, every market correction, every industry disruption follows the same pattern. Those who built wealth primarily in portable, intangible assets navigate the chaos more successfully than those who concentrated everything in physical holdings. The 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic disruption, the ongoing technological displacement of traditional careers. Each event validates the same principle that 1929 taught. But society keeps teaching the opposite lesson. You're bombarded with messages about real estate investment, about building business empires, about accumulating physical assets. The entire structure of modern finance is built around lending against collateral, which by definition means physical assets that can be seized and sold. This creates systematic pressure to concentrate wealth in exactly the forms that are most vulnerable to disruption. Banks won't loan you money to develop skills or build relationships, even though these forms of capital often provide better returns and greater resilience than physical assets. The families who understood this in 1929 didn't just survive the Depression. They positioned themselves to thrive in the recovery that followed. When the economy eventually stabilized and grew, they had capabilities that were in high demand. Doctors who had maintained their practices through the crisis saw expanding patient bases as people could afford care again. Lawyers who had navigated Depression-era legal complexities had developed expertise that was valuable in the new regulatory environment. Accountants who had helped businesses survive had relationships and reputations that generated referrals and opportunities. Meanwhile, those who had concentrated wealth in physical assets faced a much longer recovery period. Property values took years to return to pre-crash levels. Businesses that had failed couldn't simply restart when conditions improved. Physical wealth that had been liquidated during the crisis couldn't be easily rebuilt. The gap between those who had prioritized portable, intangible wealth and those who hadn't widened dramatically in the decades following the crash. This creates a profound question about how you're building wealth right now. Look at where your resources are flowing. Are you primarily accumulating things or developing capabilities? Are you building wealth that requires defending or wealth that requires cultivating? Are you investing in assets that are vulnerable to forces beyond your control, or assets that travel with you regardless of circumstances? Are you creating individual wealth, or embedding yourself in communities of mutual support? The honest answer for most people reveals they're repeating the same mistakes that destroyed fortunes in 1929. Overextended on mortgages for houses bigger than they need. Concentrated in retirement accounts tied to market performance beyond their influence. Dependent on single employers or industries that could disappear. Isolated from meaningful community networks. Building wealth that looks impressive but crumbles under pressure. The Jewish families who thrived through the Depression weren't smarter or more talented than their neighbors. They were applying lessons learned through centuries of surviving impossible circumstances. They understood that true wealth isn't what you own. It's what you can do and who you're connected to. They knew that the most valuable assets are invisible to tax collectors and immune to market crashes. They had learned that community resilience trumps individual accumulation. You're standing at a similar crossroads right now, even if you don't recognize it. Economic instability isn't some historical anomaly. It's the normal state of affairs interrupted by brief periods of stability. The question isn't whether you'll face disruption in your lifetime. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it comes. Are you building wealth that can survive the unsurvivable? Are you developing capabilities that have value regardless of economic conditions? Are you embedding yourself in communities that provide mutual support? The families who learned from 1929 didn't just change their investment strategy. They changed their entire conception of what wealth means and how it's built. They understood that education is wealth. Skills are wealth. Relationships are wealth. Reputation is wealth. Community position is wealth. These forms of capital compound over time, travel with you anywhere, and become more valuable during crisis rather than less. And those who truly absorbed what we've explored here, who recognize the depth of this shift in perspective, will mark their commitment by dropping in the comments. Invisible wealth survives everything. Because you understand now that what matters isn't what others can see, it's what they can't take away. You just discovered a framework for thinking about wealth that most people will spend their entire lives never questioning. The conventional wisdom about real estate, stocks, and physical assets isn't wrong. It's just incomplete and dangerously misleading. This channel exists specifically to reveal these hidden patterns that change everything once you see them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of this puzzle, and hit that like button because this perspective deserves to reach people who are ready to hear it. What's coming next will take this even further into territory that makes people deeply uncomfortable. There's a reason why certain groups consistently rebuild faster after every crisis, and it has nothing to do with the explanations you've been given. The next video reveals the mechanism behind this pattern that operates in plain sight yet remains invisible to most observers.